Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be talking about a tier list, but it's not just any tier list, it's going to be the BT9 tier list. So BT9 has lots of new decks to cover, and it does change the meta quite a bit. And if you're unfamiliar with how I generally like to do my tier lists, I'll break them down into 3 categories. Well, realistically, only 2 categories. So the very first category is going to be the meta. So this is just the decks that you're more commonly going to see in tournaments, and these are the decks that have the highest tendency to, win. And then just underneath that, we have all of the rogue decks. So these are all of the decks that are still playable. You'll still see them in some capacity, but they do have a little bit of a harder time winning as consistently compared to some of the more meta decks. And then the last category is going to be the casual, which I just labeled as literally everything else because there's just a lot of different decks in Digimon, and going over all of them is a little bit on the harder side, so this is just a more focused in look at what I think that the meta is going to be in BT9. So starting things off with the big one that's on everyone's mind is, what is the meta? So as far as what the meta is, it's going to consist of just a good healthy variety of decks. So we have Alphamon as the premier deck. This is going to be the boogeyman deck of the format, supposedly poised to be the best deck. So what's making Alphamon so good is, well, he is just the best OTK deck. So when it comes to OTKing, you're just going to build your stack in Raising, move it out, and then combo off to be able to kill the opponent, or at least break all of their security all in one go, and try to pressure them from that point forward to either win the game on the next turn or die. So that's kind of what Alphamon is trying to do, and he does it the best compared to all of the others because of all of the different search tools that he has to help with his overall consistency. And that's why I think Metal Garurumon X Antibody is the second best OTK deck, just because it's playing into that same style of strengths, where you're just going to build your stack in Raising, and then move out to combo off, and try to kill the opponent all in that turn, and Metal Garurumon does have the damage to be able to do it on top of the draw and consistency as well, just not as much consistency as something like Alphamon. Plus, it doesn't have as many solutions to Alphamon, so it's a little bit more riskier of an OTK, just because Alphamon in the proper scenarios is going to have protection from deletion, DP reduction, and either bounce effects or protection against being put into the security. So he just has a lot more protection compared to Metal Garurumon X, which only realistically has protection from battle, which is basically giving him pseudo jamming. He's still very vulnerable to options, but you could tech Metal Garurumon X to be able to splash in some red for a delicate plan to try to turn off the opponent's security options, and there's just a lot of flexibility in how you could build that deck to incorporate it, just because of the new duo tamer between Sora and Matt, and just running Hero. But those are the 2 best OTK decks, and as far as the 2 best control decks, we have Security Control and Bellastarmon. The big differences between the 2 is, well, Security Control is more reliant on its security, so if its security is bad, then, well, you kind of do just lose the game. But it has lots of recovery effects to try to rig its security the best it possibly can, compared to Bellastarmon, which, once all 5 security is done, that's kind of it. There is no more threats in security that you're afraid of going against Bellastarmon. So, the recovery factor does make Security Control a little bit more unpredictable, but a little bit stronger at times, just because it's still playing with a wide variety of different removal options to try to handle the opponent's threats, while recovery also could help keep the opponent off of their game plan and off of their OTK. But Bellastarmon does generally have a more threatening security as a whole, just because, well, Bellastarmon likes a whole bunch of really big and powerful options that it wants to be playing with, and the later the game goes, the easier it is it's going to be able to play Bellastarmon to be able to use your options like a Swiss Army knife to handle any situation that you're going to be up against through your various different options. And the inclusion of blue, thanks to the new tamer, makes Bellastarmon have even more tech and tools that it could call upon to try to answer various different problems. So they're both very good control style of decks if you want to try to take a more control style of approach. But as far as low to the ground aggro decks go, we still have Armor Rush, and it also has some extra defense in the form of Magnamon and Magnamon X Antibody. So Magnamon X Antibody basically has Armor Purge on steroids, where when he dies, he's just going to put himself into the security instead of going to the trash, so he's also trying to help keep you alive, while having the ability to redirect the attack, which is, again, basically like Blocker on steroids. So it's just a really good card to help be aggressive and defensive all at the same time. On top of the fact that you were already just playing to the strengths of armor, which have some built-in protection, so it allows you to punch as hard and as quickly as you possibly can. And in a similar style of fashion, we still also have Imperial Dramon as one of the premier aggro decks as well, just because, well, if the opponent is still trying to build up their combo, well, you could kind of build your combo, chip at the opponent's security, and then close out the game with one big power turn. And if you could do that before the opponent has their OTK combo, then you're probably going to have a good time and be able to take the game. So it's another really good check to those aggro style of decks, but it does have a little bit of a harder time against the control-based decks because you do need a field presence, and that's what the control-based decks is trying to take advantage of, is the fact that you do need to have Digimon and cards on the field. Which is what makes the OTK decks really good into some of the control decks, just because, well, if they could bypass their options and threats and security, then there's really nothing for them to control. And then as far as just some other really strong decks that are going to be highly represented in the BT9 meta, we have Grandis Kuwagamon, which is another OTK deck. I think it's like the worst of the best OTK decks, but it's still just a really strong OTK deck to lean into. And a similar sentiment is said about Wargreymon X Antibody, just because, well, Wargreymon has the abilities to be really, really safe swinging into the opponent's security, but the consistency factor, like Grandis, isn't exactly there because you need to see very specific cards in order to have a very specific damage count. Otherwise, you're just going to be hitting the opponent's security somewhat hard and not necessarily having the ability to close it out, but you do have, unlike all of the other OTK-based decks outside of Alphamon, some built-in protection against the opponent's options to try to at least keep your Digimon around. And then the big outlier of this whole meta is going to be Shine Greymon, or Yellow Hybrids. Kind of unsure the direction that this style of deck wants to take, but the fact that Jet Sylphimon did get limited to 1 did kind of hurt the whole hardcore hybrid control-based strategy we saw in previous metas, but now with that gone, it opens up the space to be a little bit more aggressive with either Shine or Rise packages to try to, lean into the strengths of what Hybrids is trying to do, which is chip at the opponent's security, and then have a good turn where you're just going to amass a lot of memory because of all of your different tamers giving you a lot of memory, and then just go Hybrid Swing, Hybrid Swing, Hybrid Swing, and the game is over. And I think that the deck is still really, really strong at doing that type of strategy, especially since the Rise package lets you play your Tamers for free and also has a really solid damage output as well to help chip relatively quickly and aggressively. And then as far as all of the other decks that you're probably going to end up seeing in the meta in some shape, form, or capacity, we have D-Reapers. So D-Reapers leading the pack into the Rogue category is still just a really strong deck. It is kind of leaning into what the OTK decks want to do, except it's a little bit more true to its combo. And the fact that we do have Death Xmon to include in various different decks, including D-Reapers, makes it a very powerful card to use, and especially for the way D-Reapers wants to play, a very powerful card for them because they don't really have lots of ways to interact with the opponent's field. Sure, they do have some removal cards, and you could always tech in some removal cards, but it's not going to be nearly as good as what Death Xmon is going to be providing, which makes it a very easy card to run because, well, you're just going to amass your field while the opponent amasses theirs, and you can take advantage of the opponents amassing their field with an easy Death Xmon. And then you also have cards like Starmon to help pick apart the opponent's Psychmon, so that way you could actually use your cards to the utmost capacity, and you don't really need any other tech and tools outside of that, and you're just sticking in line with the whole D-Reaper play of just building up your mother and then ending the game with a big Reaper turn. And the fact that X Antibody is a pretty decent card at filling your mother's inheritable sources, so that way you could try to play some of your cards a little bit faster, makes it a really strong deck in this type of a format, but I do think it does struggle against some of the other decks, which is why it's put into the rogue category and why all of these other decks are kind of put into the rogue category as well. So that's kind of why Mastimon is also still here. She's still a really strong deck. When she steamrolls hard. It's just that getting to that steamroll point might be a little bit harder, and because a lot of decks are leaning more into the OTK style, where they're just going to be hiding their main Digimon in raising and only moving out to potentially kill the opponent, it does make Mastimon a little bit worse because she does want to try to interact with the opponent's field to actually get value off of the cards. Although it does have some consistency issues, it still has various different ways of trying to be able to defend itself even against OTK decks. And that's kind of a similar sentiment to Black War Greymon, with the new inclusion of a lot of Tamer hate to try to counteract some of the go-wide strategies with your Tamers, and utilizing your Tamers as digging tools because they're not Digimon and they're pretty safe to use, so they could get punished by Black War Greymon, or you could try to tech Black War Greymon to be a little bit more aggressive. It's just a worse version in like a more red-based version of the deck than a dedicated War Greymon X antibody. So it is kind of in that awkward space where it could counter a lot of the top decks because of popping Tamers, and it's one of the only decks that has Tamer interactions outside of Mastimon. But if you are just playing the wrong type of a build for the wrong meta, because you could build it differently, then you're going to do very, very poorly. Then on top of that, that's kind of similar to why Gallantmon is still a really good deck. He has lots of solid ways to deal lots of damage and very good combo play and control style of gameplay. It's just, again, if he can't delete anything, he's going to have a hard time at utilizing the majority of his abilities. So he just actually wants to try to burn the opponent's security more than actually use Security Attack Plus to deal damage, and it does rely heavily on the opponent having specific setups, whether it's their trash is at a specific amount, or it's them having enough Digimon on the field, or the lack of Digimon on the field to be able to utilize his combo pieces. And that's kind of why Blue Hybrids is also on this list. It is a little bit more field dependent in order to try to get some of your abilities off. Tommy did get hit, so Blue Hybrids isn't going to be super heavily reliant on its stun-based strategy, but if it's able to have an opponent have a Digimon on the field to start racking up value with your Sora and Joes, then you still could just play it kind of similar to what Yellow Hybrids is transitioning to, where you're just lining up big hybrid swing turns more than just actually utilizing the hybrids for their abilities. And as far as decks that are still able to perform relatively well, we do have the Ancient Greymon OTK deck, which is probably just another OTK deck, and it's slightly worse than all of the other OTK decks that are above it. So I do think it is a little bit more consistent than Grandis, and it does have some really solid damage output. It's just not going to be as popular to play as something like Grandis, because Grandis actually has some interesting defensive style of play while you're going up your stack to at least potentially ruin some of the opponent's plays going into their next turn, and Ancient Greymon doesn't necessarily have that ability where some of the other OTK decks kind of do. So it is still just a really strong OTK deck, and it does have lots of new tech and tools to lean into. It's just not going to be as good as Grandis or some of the more meta-defining OTK decks. And similar to that, we have Green Hybrids, which, again, all of these hybrid strategies are still really, really good. It's just in the face of OTK, they're not going to be as good. You could still build Green Hybrids to try to outpace the opponent and try to build a large stack really quickly and put lots of pressure on them to try to force an OTK or fold and crumble underneath the pressure. And that's kind of also the same style of role that Beelzemon is doing, where Beelzemon has some really solid power plays, has some really solid consistency, except it also has a little bit of RNG with what you're trying to mill to be able to optimize some of your plays. Sometimes if you mill correctly, which again is a factor outside of your control, then you can make really powerful plays really fast, but sometimes when you can't, then the deck kind of just stumbles and fumbles around, but still has some really strong style of play for this type of meta. then as far as the last rogue deck, I'm just going to do a disservice and label a whole bunch of other OTK decks. So there is more than just these OTK decks in the meta. So you do have something like Jellyforce, you do have something like Shine Greymon, more red based. Like, there's a whole bunch of decks that were able to OTK the opponent. They're just not as good as what we currently have, and that's kind of the whole name and game of this format is OTK format. The whole format is warped and based around Alphamon and these OTK-based decks, just because, well, they have the consistency and damage output to be able to do what they need to do faster than some of the other normal or traditional based decks, and that's kind of what allows some aggro decks to do well and some control decks to do well, depending on what the OTK deck that they're going to be facing. But I do think in the grand scheme of things, Alphamon is probably the best deck in the format just because of A, consistency, B, his level of protection, and C, his damage output are all better than every other OTK deck on this list. But because the name of the format is OTK, it does just allow all of the other OTK decks to be able to exist in some capacity. But for the most part, this is just all my opinion on what I think that the BT9 meta is going to be looking like. Anything that's labeled, for the most part, inside of a category, I don't necessarily value higher than the other. I usually see them mostly as equal, outside of the exception of Alphamon, which is going to be labeled as the format's boogeyman. But I'm really curious to see how the BT9 meta is going to shape outside of this generalization. So that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and down in the description below are a couple of different ways you could support me and the channel. So I do have a TCG Player affiliate link, so when you use that link to buy cards off of TCG Player, then some of that money will go to supporting me and the channel. I also do make and sell playmats over on Overcard Gamers on Facebook, so when you buy a playmat with my design, then some of that money will also go to help supporting me and the channel. And on top of all of that, I do have a Twitch account over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, so giving me a follow and a subscription also helps support me there, and I do play Digimon on top of various other games on that platform as well. So thank you everyone for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.